I hesitated for a long time. The camera was supposed to be my last step, my chance to uncover the truth I couldn't ignore anymore. For several months, different thoughts kept swirling in my mind. What if I'm wrong? What if all these suspicions are just a product of my imagination? But every time I thought I might be mistaken, that maybe I had just imagined it all, I started noticing oddities again. Empty promises, the changed look in my wife's eyes, and of course, that friend of ours, the one who visited our house often, way too often. I couldn't live with it any longer. Finally, I decided to take action. Setting up the camera was easier than I had thought. At first glance, it seemed like just a way to keep an eye on what was happening in our living room, just in case. I placed it in the corner, where no one would notice it. Everyone was watching TV, busy with their own things. I started recording without telling anyone. Why? Because I knew that if I didn't check, I'd keep burning in this doubt. A few days passed, and the thoughts started creeping to my mind. What if I'm just overreacting? But I still couldn't bring myself to ignore what was clearly visible if I just paid attention. I decided to review the footage. At first, everything seemed normal. All those days I watched didn't show anything suspicious. But one of the night recordings changed everything. I saw my wife, as if nothing was wrong, greeting him. That same friend of our son's, the one who was like a brother to him. But this wasn't just a casual visit. This was a meeting I wasn't expecting to witness. I was shocked when I saw them in the living room. She was sitting on the couch, and he was standing too close. I didn't immediately understand what this meant, but when I turned on the sound, I felt everything inside me turn upside down. She was laughing, and he whispered something to her. In their eyes, in every movement, in every word, I felt something I never expected. This wasn't just a meeting between two people. This was something much more. I couldn't breathe. My heart started beating faster, but I couldn't stop the recording. My body was tense. I felt air escape in my chest, but I kept watching because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My mind was falling apart with what was happening. She allowed him to hold her hand, and then he leaned in, and I understood what was coming next. Shock. Not just confusion, but true shock. Not like when I thought something was wrong, but like the ground had disappeared beneath me. This wasn't just a moment of betrayal. This was the moment that destroyed everything I had built my life on. At that moment, I realized that this footage wasn't just a video recording. It was a document of my destruction, my world, in which I had lived with a certainty that everything was fine. I watched, unable to believe that my life had been tied to this person, to a woman I trusted. I saw them say something to each other, something I didn't want to hear. Then their bodies began to close the gap. I watched them kiss. Everything that followed, I didn't want to see, but I couldn't stop it. I couldn't look away from the screen. It was torturous. I didn't understand what was happening, but everything in my mind was merging into one thought. He was in her hands, and she was no longer mine. Anger came instantly, but alongside it came a sense of despair. Not just pain. It was something far more terrifying. A feeling that everything I had believed in was a lie. I watched, realizing that everything I knew about my life was crumbling right before my eyes. I lost her. I lost my world. I sat in the dark, as if the world around me had disappeared. The camera screen was still on, but I couldn't watch anymore. Even though I tried to close my eyes, everything I saw kept haunting me in my mind. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a blow I couldn't survive. My wife, the one I considered the closest person to me, shared something with that guy, our son's friend. But how? Why hadn't I noticed? I stood up, my hands trembling. My heart was beating so loudly it felt like it could be heard in every room. I tried to catch my breath, but the air felt thick. I couldn't believe this was real. Maybe this was just some mistake. Maybe it wasn't what I thought. I started rewinding the footage again. With each new frame, my certainty grew stronger. No, this wasn't a mistake. It had happened. Shock began to give way to anger. I stood up and started pacing the room. It didn't make sense. How? How could she? We had been together for so many years. We built this house, this family. We trusted each other. We created this world, and she just destroyed it. Just like that. In one night, my eyes couldn't stay closed any longer. I realized that all this time, when I thought everything was fine, when I believed in our love, she was just playing me. I kept replaying those moments. Why hadn't I noticed? How could it have stayed hidden from me? All these months, all these years, she had built her own world within ours, and I was blind to it. All this time I was with her, and I didn't see a single sign, no hints. How was that possible? Why hadn't I asked her about what troubled me? Why hadn't I trusted my instincts? I started doubting myself. Why hadn't I felt it sooner? I asked myself questions for which there were no answers. Maybe I had been too trusting, too calm in our world. Why had I spent so much time on work, on my career, on all these things that didn't matter when everything had fallen apart? Why had I let myself be so naive? All of this felt unreal. I tried to remember the moments when I felt something, when something in her behavior had raised a red flag. But there was nothing. Or maybe I just didn't want to see it. I accepted her excuses, her smiles, her words, and it all turned out to be a lie. I tried to calm down, but I couldn't. The emptiness that had overwhelmed me didn't let me breathe. I clenched my fists, rage filling me. She was with him, my friend, my acquaintance, the one we had sat at the same table with, laughed, and talked about our lives. All this time, I had trusted both of them. I had built a relationship on lies, and now I had nothing left to lose. I stood there, trying to gather myself, but there were so many questions in my head that I didn't know where to start. Why? Why did this happen? And how could it have happened without warning me? I wasn't ready for this truth. My mind refused to accept it. Why hadn't I noticed sooner how she was changing? Why hadn't I felt something was off? There were no answers. And with each new question, I felt like everything in my world was crumbling. I didn't know where to start. Everything I had gone through in the past few hours didn't make sense. The camera, the footage, my wife, everything was a tangled mess of pain and disappointment. I stood in the room, thinking about how to approach her, how to tell her that I knew, how to ask why she had done this. But what could I even say to her? I decided that I couldn't stay silent any longer. I needed to know the truth, no matter what it was. I felt my anger and confusion overwhelming me. I decided she had to hear this from me, not from a camera. I left the room and headed toward her. She was sitting on the couch as if nothing had happened, as if her world hadn't just crumbled. She was watching TV, and I hated her for it. Everything seemed so normal, so ordinary, just like always. She had no idea what I had just been through, and that she was the one who had shattered me. I took a few steps toward her and said, my voice breaking more with each word, "We need to talk." She turned to me, her eyes calm, as if she hadn't expected this. I looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I saw her vulnerable, although she probably didn't realize it. She was the same as always, familiar. I sat across from her, but the words that should have come out of me felt like they were stuck. "What's this about?" she asked, and there was no worry or fear in her voice. Just indifference. "You know what this is about. I've seen everything. All the footage." I said, unable to hold it in any longer. It came rushing out, and I felt my anger overwhelm me. "Did you really think I would notice? Did you really think I would know?" Her face paled for a moment, but then she exhaled and smiled. "You watched the footage? And what are you going to do with it now?" Her tone wasn't one of guilt, but of exhaustion. "You're accusing me, but don't you think this didn't just happen out of nowhere?" I was stunned. She didn't seem surprised. There was no feeling of guilt, no shame. She spoke as if this was something completely normal, something that could just be explained away. "Don't you see that I suffered too?" she continued, her voice growing more confident. "You were always busy, always with your work, always with your own things. You never saw me. You never saw how alone I was, how I needed you, but you were too busy with everything except me. Do you think I didn't try to handle it?" Her eyes started to shine. "You're the reason I started looking for support from others. You left me, and now you want to blame me?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She didn't say sorry. She didn't admit her fault. No, she started to justify herself, blaming me for being a bad husband. She talked about how hard it was for her, how I had ignored her. I sat there, unable to believe my ears. I thought she would at least admit her mistake, that at least something in her words would show she understood that what she did wasn't just a mistake. But no, she blamed me. So it's my fault then? I exhaled, feeling my anger rise again. You cheated on me with our son's friend because I didn't pay enough attention to you? Is that your excuse? Her gaze became hard, and her words felt like a knife to my soul. You're too demanding. You're too busy to notice anyone around you. You're always at work, and I, as your wife, was just supposed to wait around for when you pay attention to me? Do you think I didn't try to understand what was happening? But you closed all the doors for me. So yeah, I did it. And if you want to know, yes, it was easier with him than it was with you. With each of her words, I felt something inside me breaking. How could this be possible? How could she justify her betrayal like this? I thought that at least she would apologize, that at least she would feel some guilt. But no, she was so sure of her right to it that I didn't know what to do. Everything I had loved about this woman was gone. There was only emptiness left. I realized that there was no going back for us. Everything we had built was a lie, and I could no longer trust either her or myself. Our relationship no longer made sense. There was no room for maneuver, destroyed by her words. Now I was alone. I sat in the dark, not moving. The silence around me was almost tangible. Everything in my life seemed to be destroyed. The camera, the recordings, her words. I felt like each of these moments crashed over me again and again. My life, my family, my belief in people. Everything was falling apart, and I didn't know what to do about it. How could I have let all this happen? From the very beginning, I always put my family first, always tried to be the best husband and father, supported her, and took care of our son. I always thought everything I did made sense. But now, it felt like I had been building a sandcastle, and now that sandcastle was gone. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself. Who was I now? How could I have been so blind? My mind was full of questions with no answers. I couldn't believe that my wife, the one who said she loved me, who had been there through the hardest moments, could do this to me. And now, she didn't just cheat on me. She justified her actions by shifting the blame to me. She said I had been a bad husband, that I was to blame for her betrayal. And I sat there, not knowing what to say because in her eyes, I was exactly what she described me as, a weak, indifferent man who hadn't noticed her. But that wasn't the truth. I had always tried to be there for her, to be her support. Now I doubted everything. My wife, my son, my friends, myself. How could this have happened without me noticing? How could I have missed the signs that something was wrong? I couldn't trust anyone anymore, because even the people I thought were close to me could betray me. My son? I thought I knew him, but now I had doubts. How could I not have noticed that this guy, our son's friend, was sneaking around behind my back? How could I not have realized what was going on in our home? I remembered their conversations, their laughter when they were together. I remembered how they sat side by side, and I didn't notice anything suspicious. How could I have been so naive? How could I not see that my world was crumbling? I was losing control of everything that once seemed stable and true. I felt anger and resentment burning inside me, and with each passing day, I withdrew more into myself. Anger gradually turned into depression. I didn't know what to do. Everything I had done before, everything that had once brought me joy, now felt meaningless. I sat in this empty house, surrounded by the shadow of broken relationships, and didn't know where to go from here. What should I do with this situation? Fight for something that had already been destroyed, or just detach myself from everything and forget? I wanted to run away, escape all of this, move to another city, start life over from scratch. But what about my son? How would I explain to him why all of this happened? I couldn't do that. I couldn't leave him. And yet, I didn't know if I could ever forgive her, if I could ever come back to this house and believe in what we once had. I didn't want to stay in this dead end, but I had no choice. I felt like I was losing myself, and I didn't know where to go. The quiet night, the silence, the sounds I hadn't heard before. Everything I had been through seemed to fade away in this moment, as I sat alone, fists clenched, trying to process what had happened. Each breath, each movement, even the shadow in the corner of the room felt foreign to me. I was here, in this house that had once been my sanctuary, but now it felt unbearably empty. I could feel time dragging on, and it was getting harder to figure out what to do next. The first few days after that scene with my wife were a nightmare. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. I didn't know what to do, leave her like I had planned, or try to put everything back together. But what was there to rebuild? What could be restored when trust had been shattered? It wasn't just infidelity. It was betrayal. And the scariest part, I didn't know if I could ever trust her again. My life, the one I had built for years, had been reduced to rubble, and I didn't know if it was worth trying to restore. I went through so many emotions: anger, resentment, pain. They all intertwined, preventing me from finding peace. But at some point, after sleepless nights and endless thoughts, I realized I had no other choice but to act. I had to make a decision. I started thinking back to everything that had been between us, not just the bad, but the good too. There had been times when we laughed, when we supported each other, when we made plans for the future. I knew that once we had been happy. But what now? Could we return to what we had? Or did I need to let go of a life that no longer made sense? I didn't know if I could forgive her, but I realized that if I really wanted to try to fix something, I had to be ready to fight for it. Not for her, not for anyone else, but for myself. Because I couldn't stay stuck in this swamp where every day I woke up and thoughts of betrayal wouldn't let me live. I had to make a choice. I stood at a crossroads. If I decided to stay, I would have to learn to forgive. But was I ready for that? Or should I just leave her, leave all of this behind, and start anew? I was ready to make one of two choices. Either try to fix our relationship and fight for my family, or break this cycle, let her go, and move on. I knew the second path wouldn't be easy, that I might never forget what she did. But with each hour, I found myself leaning more toward the thought that what mattered most was rebuilding my life. I decided that I would start by talking to her. I didn't know what would change, but I knew I couldn't stay in this swamp, not knowing where to go. I had to be honest with myself and with her. The thought crossed my mind. If I stay, I'll have to learn to forgive, but I wasn't sure I could. And maybe it was time to let her go and give myself a chance at a new beginning. It had been several days since I made the decision to talk to her, and even though things felt clear in my head, in reality, every step, every word felt heavy. But there was something that troubled me even more than my own pain. Our son, Ethan. He was a teenager, and despite his age, he had always been thoughtful and deeply tuned into the mood in our home. He didn't speak openly about how he felt, but I knew that he sensed something was wrong. That evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, still trying to make sense of everything, when Ethan walked in. He looked unsettled, like something was bothering him, but he wasn't sure how to bring it up. I tried to act normal, smiled at him, and offered to talk, but his eyes were different. This wasn't teenage moodiness or confusion. It was something more. He knew something was off. "Dad, are you hiding something from me?" he asked. His voice was soft but firm. There was more than curiosity in his words. I saw how carefully he was watching my every move, trying to read my reactions. I didn't know what to say. On one hand, I was ready to tell him the truth. I didn't want him living in the dark. On the other hand, I couldn't give him information that would destroy his world. He was still too young to carry that weight. But I couldn't lie to him either. Not to my son. I don't know how to explain this to you. I began, feeling the words catch in my throat. Sometimes, life throws things at us that change everything. I just want you to know, no matter what's happening, none of this is your fault. Ethan stayed quiet. His face was tense. He didn't say anything back, but I could see how much he was struggling inside. I knew his world would never be the same again, because for a child, there's nothing worse than realizing their parents aren't who they thought they were. The next day, I tried reaching out to my friends. I needed someone to talk to. I needed support. But what I found instead was a wall of silence. I met up with one of my oldest friends, Matt, at a cafe, and I noticed something strange in his eyes. His look was heavy, like he knew something I didn't. "You doing okay?" he asked without looking directly at me, but his voice was tight with tension. My chest tightened. I couldn't hide what was happening anymore. He was one of my closest friends, but in that moment, I felt something between us had cracked. He knew what was going on and had kept it from me. I couldn't understand why he hadn't warned me, why he hadn't said anything sooner. "You knew?" I asked, unable to hide the anger in my voice. "You knew about this?" Matt looked at me, saying nothing at first, but his silence said everything. I realized he had known. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to tell me something. To warn me. "I didn't know how to tell you," he finally said. "It wasn't my place. I didn't want to get involved." Those words broke something in me. I sat at that table, feeling like I wasn't just losing my wife, but my friends too. The people I had trusted to be there for me were disappearing into the background, offering no advice, no help, no hand to hold. It became painfully clear. I couldn't trust anyone anymore. All these years, I've been living in a world built on silence and lies. Once again, I stood at a crossroads. What now? Fighting for this family seemed pointless when there was no trust, no mutual understanding. I couldn't forget her words, her excuses. But leaving was just as hard. It wasn't just about ending things with my wife. It was about letting go of the life I had believed in, of everything that had meant something to me. I felt it all slipping away, and I had no idea what came next. I sat in an empty room, one that used to hold an entire world. A world built on trust, on love, on dreams of a future we were supposed to build together. But now, all of it had been destroyed, like a house of cards collapsing from a single careless touch. I didn't know how to pick up the pieces after what had happened. All that was left for me was a choice. And I understood this decision would be the most important of my life. Every night, I woke up feeling trapped. My thoughts kept looping like I was locked inside a cage. What do I do with this? Forgive? Or finally break away? Stay here or walk away for good? I kept trying to figure out what was right, but the answers wouldn't come. All the emotions I've been carrying had turned into a heavy weight. Anger, disappointment, pain. I couldn't force myself to forgive her, but I also couldn't keep living with everything left unresolved. Every conversation with her only made things worse. I searched for some glimpse of genuine regret in her words, but all I heard were excuses. She didn't understand what she had destroyed. She thought things could just go back to the way they were, but that's not how it works. I realized that if I kept living like this, day by day, I would lose myself completely. I couldn't return to a relationship where trust had been shattered and respect no longer existed. I felt that I had to free myself from this before I became someone I no longer recognized. But what would come next? What about Ethan? Our family? I couldn't just walk away and pretend like none of it mattered. And yet, staying with a woman who had betrayed me felt impossible. I knew I couldn't keep living in this fog, this dead end. Whatever I chose, the consequences would be painful. But I understood this moment would define the rest of my life. I made up my mind. I couldn't continue in this relationship, not out of anger, not for revenge, but because I finally understood that I couldn't live with someone who didn't respect me, didn't value me, and didn't understand what real love meant. I needed to reclaim my life, to find meaning again, and I couldn't let myself stay in a place where every day reminded me of the pain. I made my decision. I would tell her it was over. We had to go our separate ways. It wasn't just a decision. It was a battle within myself. I knew this choice would have consequences. My family would break apart. I would lose her, lose everything we had built together. But I couldn't leave things as they were. I had to start over. I stood up and reached for the phone. I called her. But this time, there was no fear, no hesitation in my voice. I knew this was the only right thing to do. I needed to escape this hell, to free myself and give myself a chance at a new life, a life without lies and without pain. I could feel something shifting inside me. I was ready for a new path, ready to start from zero. This was my chance, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. I sat in the same room where it all began, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of calm starting to return. Everything I had been through had left a mark that would never fade, and I wasn't sure if I would ever be able to forget. But I was beginning to realize that maybe this was the start of a new chapter in my life. I was no longer the man I used to be, the one who lived in illusions and held on to the hope that everything could somehow be fixed. No, now I was someone else. Life doesn't always give us second chances. But sometimes, when everything collapses, it forces us to take a long, hard look at ourselves and reevaluate what truly matters. I realized that the betrayal hadn't destroyed me. It had forced me to see more clearly. I could never go back to the life I had before. I could never build my future on a lie, even if part of me desperately wanted to. Yes, the loss was devastating, but through that pain, I found myself again. Maybe I had been too attached to the past. Maybe I had just been trying to get back what I had lost. But I learned that sometimes, in order to move forward, you have to let go. And I began letting go. It wasn't easy. The thought that the family I had built was now broken never left me. But I knew I had to think about my future, not just my past. I was ready to move forward, even if it meant my life would never look the same again. I started rebuilding. I found a job I had put off for years. I returned to old hobbies I had abandoned. Little by little, I began to feel stronger. I didn't know what would happen with my family. Ethan needed time to understand and process everything. And my wife, I wasn't sure I would ever be able to forgive her. Maybe someday we would speak again, but I couldn't imagine her being part of my life anymore. Our relationship wasn't just broken by her betrayal. It was broken by the realization that I no longer believed in it. Everything had changed. But maybe that was exactly what I needed. I couldn't live in the past anymore, and I knew I had to find my new path. Not for her, not even for Ethan, but for myself. I was ready to begin again, to leave the old wounds behind and move forward. Even then, I didn't know what would come next. What if I had stayed and tried to fix things? What if I had forgiven her, despite everything? But I couldn't turn back, and those questions no longer mattered. What mattered was that I had made a choice, the one that felt right, even if it wasn't easy. I sat in silence, thinking about how things could have ended differently. But I didn't have the answers, and maybe I never would. Life leaves stories unfinished, and sometimes we'll never know what might have been. Still, I knew one thing. I had started a new chapter in my life. And no matter what I had lost, I was ready for whatever lay ahead.